My final report is on the Green River Killer by Jessica McKinney. Gary Ridgway, who was born February 18th, 1949. He was originally from Salt Lake City, Utah, but moved to Washington State in 1960. He was the second of three boys for his parents. His father, Thomas Newton, was a bus driver, and his mother, Mary Rita Ridgway, was a sales clerk at J.C. Penney. Gary was raised near Seattle's Pacific Highway. He struggled throughout school and was held back 2 grades in high school. He was sent to Vietnam after high school. Once he returned to Washington from Vietnam, he got a job painting trucks. He continued working the same job for 30 years. Ridgway had no juvenile criminal record, although there were signs. He committed arson, wet the bed until the age of 13, and he tortured animals. One instance was he killed a cat by trapping it in a freezer. In July of 1982, children found the strangled body of Wendy Caulfield, 16, floating in Seattle's Green River. Over the following weeks, 4 more bodies were discovered in or along its banks, all women and all strangled. On August 15th, there were more bodies found, and Detective David Reichert was one of the first authorities to arrive at the scene. Marcy Chapman, 31, was found in the shallow water alongside the naked body of 17-year-old Cynthia Hens. Nearby in the undergrowth lay the body of Opal Mills, 16, blue trousers knotted around her neck, breast exposed, bruises apparent on her arms and also her legs. On August 16, 1982, after the King County Sheriff's Office set up the Green River Task Force to investigate the killings, the body count rose as more victims were discovered along the river and in the area around the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Over the next 2 years, the Green River Killer sexually assaulted and murdered more than 40 more women, from Washington to Oregon. April 30th, prostitute Marie Malver, 18, was last seen by her boyfriend getting into a paint-patched pickup with a dark-haired man about 30 to 40 years old. 4 days later, police questioned Ridgway at his home. He denied knowing anything or knowing Marie. In 2003, Ridgway told investigators that he stood against the fence during his original 1983 questioning to conceal scratches Malver had left on his arm while trying to escape. Ridgway said he then burned the scratches with battery acid to disguise them once the detectives had left. In May 1984, Ridgway contacted police. He said that this was to assist them. They asked him to take a polygraph test, and he ended up passing the test. In 1986, with very few reliable leads in the Green River Killer case, the authorities were desperate for any information to further the investigation. Having read about the ongoing case in the press, convicted serial killer Ted Bundy wrote to Reichert offering his help in the case. Reichert flew to Florida, where Bundy was being held on death row. During discussions, Bundy advised authorities that the killer might be revisiting his victims' corpses and performing sexual acts on them, a hypothesis Ridgway later confirmed. Investigators started cracking under pressure. The county investigator, John Blake, became fixated with a lawyer that he thought was the murderer and was discharged from his job on mental disability grounds. The King County Sheriff, Vernon Thomas, resigned in 1987, mostly because of being unable to solve the Green River killings. Shortly after this, the budget for the Green River Killer Task Force was slashed, making further progress near impossible. So it really bothered him that he could not solve this case. That's mostly why he resigned. And then, of course, after so long, they didn't want to give all these funds to continue to have the task force for the Green River Killer. And that's when they drastically dropped the funding for it, which made things a lot harder. Suspects were identified and processed, but never to much avail. All sorts of rapists and kidnappers came out of the woodwork. They were inspired by the killings happening, but none of these suspects fit the killer's profile. A cab driver who came forward to volunteer information to the police was considered a suspect for years because he seemed to know a lot about the dead women, although there was never any hard evidence against the man. Melvin Foster was inordinate amounts of time were wasted telling him or responding to his ever more indigent complaints about his civil rights infringed. Errors in the case. There were huge errors that occurred. The media circus arrest of a suspect in 1986 who turned out to be not a suspect at all. They failed to follow up on a driving license belonging to one of the murdered women. This was found by a cleaner at the Seattle airport. The license was later destroyed by the airport police after 6 months, as were the passenger manifest for relevant flights and a years-long obsession with the pink glass-like substance found at many of the crime scenes. This turned out to be a fragment of garnet stone sprinkled all over the Pacific Northwest by the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980. All these instances could have drastically helped the case. Matt Haney, the detective who put all of this together, felt that Ridgway was the one committing the murders, but he could not back this up with forensic evidence at the time. DNA testing was in its infancy, and although Ridgway gave a saliva sample, nothing could be done with it at the time. And this is why for 14 years nothing happened with the case. The case went cold. In 2001, with new techniques and forensic testing at their disposal, investigators re-examined evidence from across the years the killer had been active. This was a last-ditch effort. Beverly Himmick, a Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory forensic scientist, told the New York Times, "We didn't have a lot to work with, but we went through a lot of evidence again. We rinsed all the fingernails to look for trace evidence and swabbed the ligatures for cellular material. With one girl, we were able to find a few sperm clinging to her pubic hair. New DNA profiles from 3 victims were compared with Ridgway's thanks to the saliva sample that he had provided back in 1987. This turned out to be a match in all 3 of the cases." November 2001, close to 2 decades after the first murder, King County Sheriff Reicher announced that Ridgway, then 52 years old, was arrested in connection with 4 of the Green River killer's early victims: Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Cynthia Hens, and Carol Christensen. Christensen's body had been recovered in 1983. November 2003, in a plea bargain that spared him the death penalty in return for his confessions and information regarding the details of the murders and locations of the bodies, Ridgway entered a guilty plea to 48 charges of aggravated first-degree murder. So this obviously helped drastically when they had him for the murders of Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Cynthia Hens, and Carol Christensen. But then, of course, he admits to 48 charges. He targeted sex workers because he thought that they might not be reported missing and because he hated most of them. In 2003, he accepted a plea deal in which he was sentenced to 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. In addition, he agreed to reveal the location of undiscovered bodies. Many thought that he was responsible for more deaths, and in 2013, Ridgway said that he had murdered upward of 80 women. In December 2003, Ridgway was sentenced. A King County Superior Court judge sentenced Ridgway to 48 life sentences to be served consecutively. In December of 2003, the Kings County Sheriff's Office identified the remains of one of Ridgway's victims, previously known as Bone 17, as belonging to Lori Ann Raspotnik with the help of DNA testing. Raspotnik ran away from her home in a nearby Lewis County at age 15 in 1982 and was never seen again. Her remains were one of the 2 sets discovered in Auburn, Washington in 1985. Ridgway told authorities years later in 2002 that he had placed 2 of his victims in the same area. 20 years before Ridgway was arrested, the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory overlooked key microscopic evidence found on the clothing of his very first victim and of 7 others who followed according to interviews and a review of thousands of pages of documents obtained through public record request. The tiny spears of a unique industrial spray paint linking Ridgway to their murders could have been detected back in the 1980s. Forensic scientists involved in the case recently acknowledged preventing at least some of this 49 confirmed killings. Even some longtime investigators assigned to the case said in interviews that until now, they had been in the dark about the missed opportunity to catch the killer sooner. Only after the DNA match that led to Ridgway's arrest did a renowned trace evidence expert brought in to help with the case finally found the overlooked clues in 2003. The spray paint found on the victim's clothing wasn't sold to the public, and it was used only in the Seattle area on a wide scale in the early 1980s by Kenworth Truck Co., where Ridgway worked. Palahniuk said that in 1985, when he visited the Washington Crime Lab to train staff in discovering microscopic trace evidence, the director said he'd bring him into the case if investigators identified a suspect. Palahniuk said the director never called. 17 years later, he said, "I got a phone call saying they want us to look at the case. We ended up finding information that we could have found back then. It's very conceivable that if those things had been more carefully examined at the time, the investigation would have taken an earlier, more productive turn that pointed directly to Ridgway. A lot of testing on the evidence did not seem to apply to this case. I mentioned before that things were different back in the 80s than they are now. Forensic techniques were a lot different, although there were a lot of missed opportunities, and I believe proper techniques and proper evidence testing would have drastically helped us solve this case years earlier, and perhaps many lives could have been saved. If this case were today, I would test the saliva, a semen found. They did this years later, and it is unfortunate that it was not sooner. Standard DNA testing was done when the case first started. CODIS, Combined DNA Index System, would be used now, but it was not created until 1998. This could not have been used at that time. As time went on, forensic evolved, and that helped with the case. Again, it's mentioned above that they missed the paint, for instance, that could have pointed them towards Ridgway. That's another thing that drastically could have helped the case, like I mentioned before.